The paper is actually titled "New Media and the Birth," Dumb Type and the Birth of New Media Dramaturgy, and it's a paper that's looking at some research we've been doing around this theme that we're developing around new media dramaturgy. I'm going to begin, before I talk, with a short piece that's been made by Kawaguchi Takao and Thomas Matthias, who made this short work at our Dumb Type Symposium that was held at the Centre for Interweaving Performance Cultures in April this year.
とんでもないことをしてしまったと思って慌てふためく。心臓がバクバクと激しく打つ。背中に冷や汗が垂れ、視界が真っ白になる。一体自分がいつ何をしたのか、必死で思い返そうとする。息ができない。血液が体中の血管の内側を引っかき、肉が削られるような感覚が襲う。真っ白のフラットな音が響く。
It's actually got a different title there on the PowerPoint, but I'll be talking about that idea of whiteout and a grey zone in between. So before I begin, I'd just like to thank the organisers of Tanzkongress, Sabine German, Katrina van Winkle, and of course Holger as well, who've very kindly invited me to come and talk today about new media dramaturgy. And while this project is a project that is looking at a broad range of performance activities, from dance to theatre to installation arts, I've tried to focus somewhat on the dance side of things today, although there might not be enough dance theory for some people, so I apologise for that. But my paper will discuss the idea of new media dramaturgy, which we're calling NMD for short, in specific detail, and outline some of the thinking that applies to the concept of interweaving performance cultures. In the second part of the paper, I will offer reflections on NMD in relation to the work of Dumb Type. And we saw that very short video there, which is a work that is slowing down movement. I think it's 250 milliseconds. So each second there are 250 frames being shot by a digital camera, and then the editing's done to slow that movement down into that very precise new media dramaturgical kind of choreographic pattern across the space. Information integrated in the extreme is cancelled out close to absolute zero. In describing Dumb Type's work in terms of being a critical art practice, Asada Akira has provided us with many memorable statements. Among these, his description of Memorandum, which was made in 1999 to 2000, as information integrated in the extreme and cancelled out close to absolute zero, is helpful also in thinking about a project that might attempt to show the diversity of Dumb Type. In short, we are dealing with a remarkable complexity and diversity of work that in many respects can only be abridged by processes of categorisation. It is work that is cerebral, with groundbreaking staging and also kitsch. It combines advanced and simple technologies. It is about utopian politics and collective activism, and also about subjectivity, individualism, the Freudian uncanny, aesthetic failure and death. Information is gathered and cancelled out in a flow of mediatised performance that stimulates sensory organs and activates mind and body even while it overwhelms us with the glorious erasure of the self and a dive, literally enacted in memorandum, into the techno-sublime aesthetic storm. The storm of new media and its transformation of performance is the subject of new media dramaturgy, one of the orientations of my discussion, and indeed my provocation for this talk is to consider the work of dumb type as giving birth to a new media dramaturgy paradigm. And one of the aspects of this larger NMD project is to look at the work of dumb type, who were active from 1984 to around about 2003-04, although the company still has various incarnations in existence. And they made a series of pioneering multimedia performance artworks that incorporated dance, visual art, film, digital arts, and theatre, or monologue, to be more precise. And as a way of thinking about the historical archive and the kind of ontological development of new media dramaturgy, we're looking at their work as a kind of paradigmatic example. Helena Graham, Ed Shear and I coined the term new media dramaturgy to investigate the transformations underway in live performance in relation to and in response to new media. New media constitutes a turn to visuality, intermediality, and a dialectical move in performance that shows these expressions as embodied and visualised in the live performance space. We are interested in how these expressions might be understood compositionally and dramaturgically. Like dumb type's work, this is a field of performance in between theatre, dance, music, and visual arts. Other studies of media and performance have focused on ontologies of the live and the hybridity of live and mediatised spaces. They have addressed histories of technology, documentation and dissemination in the culture industries and introduced post-human and cyborg themes. We focus on the keyword dramaturgy, understood as a transformational, intersitual and translation practice. Dramaturgy bridges ideas and their compositional and embodied enactment. We understand what I have called elsewhere in another text an expanded dramaturgy to be one that is always showing in the production of art expressions of the ideas or traces of its process, something that performs a relation or translational process between idea, concept, statement and between idea, concept and statement, and at the other end, form, enunciation and reception. Thus, it is a dialectical process of creativity that is also practical and based in an understanding of performance as a process in work, actual work on the floor, seen before audiences. Interactivity is a key concern of NMD. We do not mean the superficial idea of interactivity, such as audiences interacting in the development of the performance by choosing story arcs, using screens or pushing buttons in the theatre or dance performance in real time. Nor do we mean using experiments using visual screen headgear and interactive software to create a more porous sense of space and time in theatrical form, although this is also possibly a very fruitful area of investigation. Instead, as Rosie Klitsch and Ed Shear argue, contemporary performance uses new media as a means of aesthetic innovation. It is what they call a training regime for the exploration of contemporary perspectives on AV and informational technologies. New media is a potentially destabilising force in their summation, but so is live performance. As they write, these two factors continually colonise each other and interact with each other. I will come to the question of the regime of media performance later, but now I want to stress the point that NMD is not about worrying about the status of the live in performance or about the virtualisation of performance. Rather, questions of destabilisation, colonisation, informational economy, and affective and ethical understandings of communication are considered as NMD material. It is about the technologies and techniques of new media in relation to the dramaturgical function of translating ideas into practices and compositional awareness. It is a nexus between content, context, form and audience, what Marianne van Kerkhoven calls listening to the bloody machine, or coincidentally, as Shikata Yukiko describes Dumbtype's work as space as image machine. I don't have time to develop this argument fully today, but to be concise, new media dramaturgy is the name we use to designate both the composition of this live performance in and through new media artworks and its effects on the audience, or on an audience, or on audiences. Interweaving media and performance. Before considering how NMD might be constituted in the work of Dumbtype, I will also make some brief comments on the second specific focus of this talk, that of interweaving performance. I'm currently a researcher in the Centre for Interweaving Performance Cultures at the Freie Universität in Berlin, where we're looking at the ways in which theatre and performance and interweaves with in the global context of intercultural forms, but also interweaving aesthetically, imbricating between different forms of performance, including the new media aesthetic coming into performance. At the risk of oversimplifying the breadth of this idea, interweaving performance begins with an aim to shift the discourse of intercultural and post-colonial theatre studies, both in their historical and contemporary fields, into a new paradigm, one that is constitutive of the significant transforming effect of globalisation. And this key word globalisation here is what I want to focus on. Just to the translators, I'm going to skip the text that's in italics there and then come to the next paragraph. The idea of interweaving seeks to make a productive intervention precisely at the point of performance in relation to questions of globalisation. It rightly notes how shortfalls in the above-mentioned theories of interculturalism tend to overemphasise binaries, and they fail to address the fuller global complexity of cultural interactions and flows. Interweaving, says Erika Fischer-Lichter, is, quote, part of a process of modernisation that takes us into the encounter with global modernity itself. It transfers spectators into a state of in-betweenness or into a third space that is an effect similar to that of globalisation. These comments will become more relevant when we look at the latter works of Dumbtype, where the key themes of globalisation and the information economy are addressed. So herein are some questions for interweaving performance in relation to NMD and the case study of Dumbtype. How to address the idea of transferring spectators into, an idea that compares to a theory of intermediality, for example. How does interweaving come to terms with the interrelationship of informational and cultural economies that exist on a global scale? How do questions of difference, intensity, and the singular acts of performance stand their ground in the face of the imbrication of interweaving? As already noted, interweaving performance considers these questions in terms of modernity as a globally transforming experience. Modernity is exhaustively critiqued for its formational agendas, dominance of capitalism, focus on war, and contemporary questions about technology, ecology, and energy. Recently, I have worked extensively with Zygmunt Bauman's theory of liquid modernity and found parallels between his idea of modernity's deterritorializing power and the notion of interweaving. In interweaving performance, we might be able to see perspectives in the work of Okada Toshiki, for example, that critically embody statements on liquid modernity, while also being primary examples of aesthetic imbrication, a staging of interweaving, as if you will. I don't have time to develop this idea today, but I mention it to suggest that interweaving performance is an approach with wide applications to our field. This brings me neatly to the work of Dumbtype. Arguably, they are one of the first groups to consider the complexity of interweaving cultures and globalisation in a critical light by using, or more correctly, inventing some of the techniques of new media dramaturgy. My question here is why Dumbtype is to be considered important in the contemporary moment. I would briefly like to highlight three aspects of Dumbtype's work as a legacy or extension of the oeuvre into the contemporary context of contemporary art. I will consider Dumtype's cosmopolitanism, utopia and critique of informational systems, and then consider also Dumtype and the repetition of image. That shows like PH, made in 1989, and SN, made in 1994, deal critically with questions of subjectivity and identity is well known. But in thinking about these performances in the here and now, perhaps the recent revived interest in cosmopolitanism can shed new light on their significance. For Nikos Papastagiannis, cosmopolitanism describes, quote, an emergent force of artistic imagination that fosters a sense of belonging through the experience of art. To briefly expand on the work of Papastagiannis in other ways, cosmopolitanism is a process of recognising that cultural differences are entangled. It is an ethical stance for Papastagiannis, that is, quote, an emergent social order that extends political rights beyond exclusive territorial boundaries. So this concept has real political value, but it's also gesturing towards the kind of sense that the arts have in creating new forms of aesthetic experience as a way of enacting a form of community. Taking this idea into a discussion about Dumtype is a way of exploring contemporaneous readings of their early works that were, as we know, often focused on ideas of exclusion and resistance to monoculturalism and normative power relationships as they concern gender, sexuality and identity. There is an ethical concern in their work to recognise the broader significance of what inclusion is and what the right to belong to global society might entail. Obviously, a point of extremely important relevance in our contemporary age. PH in particular is an example of work that explores the conundrum of what Bruce Robbins calls the need to feel global. In this work, one critic wrote, quote, humans are reduced to surrogate images and they are disciplined by the scanning technologies of global capitalism. This is a work that features these scanning bars, one of them only about half a metre off the ground and the other one passing over the heads of the performers. The choreography is developed on the basis that every minute or so the scanning beam will be passing back and forwards like a kind of photocopy beam, and that the dancers will either have to jump over it or do a choreography that enables them to lie down so that the scanning beam passes over their bodies. The possibilities for human interaction and community are extremely limited, and even in more playful scenes, people seem alienated. This is a representation of globality without cosmopolitanism. Yet a very different image of cosmopolitanism and diversity is explored in SN, a work that is utopian and also traumatic in its discussion of HIV/AIDS, made in 1994. SN counters the erasure of human agency in PH with the staging of desire for cosmopolitanism in a radical utopian form. This is seen most clearly in the use of the repetitious phrase, I dream my sex will disappear, I dream my nationality will disappear, I dream my blood will disappear, my rights, my values, and so on. This is cosmopolitanism in the guise of a utopian refusal of the status quo. I want to read SN as an expression of what the contemporary political scientist Jodie Dean calls communist desire, a desire that in her terms, quote, depends on a gap and is a moment of rupture, unquote. Why do we need rupture? Why this insistence on the idea of an avant-garde breach? Because as Dean argues, the gap is the very grounds that necessitates politics and creates the desire for solidarity. The negation of life as overdetermined, as in the statement, I dream my gender, life, identity and so on will disappear, is a condition of what Jodie Dean theorises as constitutive openness. It is in this light that I remember that Kamakura Takaaki's catalogue essay, The Performance Art of Dumtype, The Body as Love Vehicle, is still one of the most important texts on their work, and including up to and including the work SN. Even though Dean remains suspicious of the value of art in politics, her analysis of the problem of solidarity in politics shows an awareness of the kind of critical arts practice that Dummtype created. Her call to, quote, amplify the collective desire that can be created by an effective network resonates with Dummtype's performance. As we know, desire is a key word in SN, and one that is evident in contemporary theorisations of cultural politics. Another key word here, though, is amplification, and this is where Dummtype's later works, OR and Memorandum, are seen to be extensions of the desiring machines we have been discussing. I will briefly touch on the work of Boris Groys, who connects the intensification of repetition in art with what he calls ultra-modern time. We can see this in OR and most viscerally in Memorandum. A condition of ultra-modern time for Groys is one of immersion in politics. Bodies come to know themselves in and through the experience of being in political space, he argues. He argues. Bodies in this sense are not intrinsic but mutable and transformed by image, data and mediatisation. In short, they become like phantom bodies, Derrida's ghosts, an idea that I also explored brilliantly in last night's performance of Karen Levy's The Dry Piece. In her reading of Memorandum, Catherine Mazur explores qualities of ghosting connecting to observations about how gender, politics and identity are becoming intersitual through the disappearance of the body into repetitious image. She writes that, quote, women further develop their skills of working with technology and choreography to create alternative physical consciousness and transformative bodies, unquote. Her observation of gendered phantom bodies in Memorandum extends the critical approach of techno-feminism as elaborated in Haraway's landmark Cyborg Manifesto. Both Haraway and Mazur discuss how the lightness and adaptability of phantom images can be a source of revelation. I'll just show you a short scene now from this 2000 work Memorandum.
All out. Erase my memory. Welcome to the next level.
Just float. Believe blindly.
Set me to zero. At once.
So this is a work made 13 years ago now, which is kind of interesting historical reflection, I think, on the quality of the aesthetic and also on the questioning whether or not our new media paradigms of how they've transformed since that time. You can see, I think, many of the key elements of a dramaturgical patterning of the stage in that work that are still in use today. These ideas seem to be particularly well suited to the analysis of dumb type. I'm talking about Boris Groys's idea of the repetition in art and the ultra-modern time, the idea of ultra-modern time. While the sublime image of the women in OR immersed in the journey across the mountains is significantly powerful, her body is shifting and transformed, an image of ultra-modern time. That's a very famous scene from the work that I don't have time to show you today, but it's actually depicted in that slide on the lower section of that image. And the sense that Kawaguchi Takao is slipping into the informational stream of memory, presence and reality in the opening image of Memorandum is shown as an extended, repetitious, rapid eye movement tableau of images as form. Ultra-modern time represented as a form of physicalization of the act of writing, and also ultra-modern time as a form of repetitious telling of one's own story in order to bring that into being. I think it's also evident in the piece that I showed you at the very beginning, this fragmenting of a second into 250 megasecond particle seconds, or what do you call it, 250 fractions of a second, and the attention that that then places on the quality of movement as the body itself moves through space, and we start to see a different perspective on the idea of that person being in space. Ultra-modern time brings us full circle. It connects with interweaving and modernity, and to NMDs making visible the ethical encounter through dramaturgical forms. Seen in this light, dumb type's legacy has given us some key perspectives of now and future time, as well as the past. And it is the diversity of this that remains as their legacy to the involving practice of new media dramaturgy. So thank you very much.
Maybe you could elaborate a bit further on how this term actually came about, because I think the connection between media and dramaturgy is not so obvious at first, and it would be interesting to hear how it came about and how you kind of, was it more from the practical side or the connection with academic work?
It began with a conversation about how to think about the way that performance has gone into the visual field much more strongly in the last 20 years. And that began with a process where lighting and sound, not just the visual but also the sound, the field of audio sound. So design elements started to become much more prominent in the theatrical space and much more integral to the meaning of the work, I think, for the experience of the work for the audiences. And then that became much more intensified with the evolution of new media technologies, from slide projectors to data projectors to data being used in very graphic ways within the performance. And we're now experiencing performances that are constantly, I think, assaulting the audience with different kinds of affective technology, whether it's sound that is activating certain kind of registers in the body, or whether it's rapid eye movement images, or this kind of idea of a techno-aesthetic sublime. There's been a lot of writing about that, but I think there's a need to address it on a kind of a level that the word dramaturgy comes into this idea because of dramaturgy's focus on translating ideas into practice, translating a cultural moment into a presentational form or a performance form. And so that then brings in, I think, a very important dimension, which is the dimension of politics into artistic practice, because as I've theorised dramaturgy, and I know there are many different ways to theorise it, but I've always emphasised that translational process of idea, political idea, critical idea into practice and making that criticality visible in the contemporary performance process. So we're using a kind of a so-called new dramaturgy concept there, which has been influenced by the work of Marianne van Kerkhoven and been developed by work that I've done with the company Not Yet It's Difficult, but also in writing that I've done.
I was always wondering whether this newness refers more to the media side or to the dramaturgy side.
Probably it's the dramaturgy side, I think, yeah, because dramaturgy's not been well developed in its capacity to theorise new media. It's a little bit lagging behind, although there are dramaturgs who specialise in new media contexts. They're often answering technical questions rather than aesthetic or political or cultural ones.
Yeah, no, first of all, I was wondering what then new media dramaturgy would imply from a dramaturg in terms of getting the know-hows of technology. And second, I was wondering if you have any specific example in which you translated this new media dramaturgy into specific, I don't know, modules or categories, because I wonder if there's like a general new media dramaturgy, or is it something that needs to be applied for specifically for specific performances?
I think it's a very helpful question. In this study, we're not really thinking about the dramaturg per se. I think what the dramaturg does can be very often engaging in questions of new media, depending on the context they're working in. But and as I said, there are dramaturgs that have honed their practice into working in those kinds of contexts and are very much familiar with the kind of theories around new media performance, but also the technologies. Other dramaturgs, have not done that. So it's not a statement about a general statement about dramaturgy as a practice, as it might be done professionally by dramaturgs. It's a statement about dramaturgy, and it's an acknowledgement that dramaturgy is happening, is made by a composite, all the composite elements on the stage. So this is and what we're dealing with is an intensification of non-human elements of visuality and sound elements coming much more into the foreground as dramaturgical elements in the performance process. So that's really where we're going with this study. It's an attempt to grapple with that new context for staging. Does that answer the question?
I wanted to ask what your judgment is of the current situation of new media and dance specifically, and whether there's going to be more acceptance, because it seems to me like new media hasn't yet reached the arts, so to speak. It's a minority public there, although everybody carries a mobile phone and is grown up with the television, with images, but somehow it's not it's not coming through, I have the feeling.
Yes, thank you. I very much appreciate that question, and the answer I can only give is only partial, because obviously we're looking at a form that is constantly evolving. The technologies have enabled certain kinds of affective relationships to dance. In particular, I'm thinking of the work of Chunky Move and their mapping in real time of bodies moving through space, and that enabling vari-lights to actually track their bodies moving through space and creating a visual sensorium that is in complete partnership, in symbiotic relationship with the work of the dancer. And creating all sorts of, I think, really interesting philosophical ideas about, negative space and negative bodies and black light, grey light lighting bodies in space, and so on and so forth. Creating, I think, possibilities for audiences that have been read as very affective, haptic kind of experiences for audiences, and really challenging what we understand to be the field of contemporary dance. The other extreme, I think, is a simplification of the new media landscape, and I can think of examples where people are kind of they're working with a minimalist frame of new media performance to create very powerful live moments, but nonetheless, the new media or the visuality, the question of visuality and sound is so present and so evocative in the performance that you could say that it's an integral part of the dramaturgy. We're certainly moving away, I think, in some respects from the kind of spectacular sensory overload of the work of Dumb Type in their late shows. But then if you go to Ikeda Ryoji's work, the composer for Dumb Type, he now does events where, in a way, if you think about a dancer as somebody whose body is activated, well, it's the audience. The actual body of the audience member is activated by sound. I don't know if you've seen one of his works, but they're using low-frequency sound to a very intense, invasive level, and you wear earphones and you see quite dramatic kind of projections, but you feel sound. You actually are your body is physically moved by sound. And I find that very interesting because that's a kind of new level of connectivity with audiences where, you know, these are performances where our bodies are being activated against, well, we have no autonomous control over that. If we're in the space, you can't just block out the sound by blocking your ears. Yeah.
We'll have to wrap up soon. We have a last question here. I would ask both of you, please be brief.
For me, the question is always, you focused a little bit also on pictures, which showed, and you mentioned also that it has to do with art process and so on. But for me, classical dramaturgy is a little bit about reading in time. So what is the development of time if I'm sitting there from 8 o'clock until 9 o'clock and I'm participating 1 hour to see a piece? How it is readable in time, and it has much to do with sound and with moving images. So and it's a little bit missing about that. It's always so much reduced on pictures, and it's a little bit of fascination we have in this design process, very design pictures. But then it comes to me to an art analysis, that you say what you can see in the picture, how is the picture composed, what will the picture tell me? It's not so much anymore like the sense of the word dramaturgy, how is the development in time, what is coming after what is coming before something, and how, for me always, how it is readable. It's so new, and in a way I think it's really a duty of the dramaturgy to help to read these processes in time.
Yeah, I think your question it really goes to the heart of the contemporary practice of new media dramaturgy. I didn't address time today except for my brief musings on the repetitious nature of often new media practices, and that of course also has temporal implications for performance. But I don't know that I can answer the question well enough in a short period of time, but we are looking at other works within our study that are playing with sense of time through the new media aesthetic, whether it's an extended sense of time, or I think the key works that I'm looking at are dealing with fragmentation and interruption to a very high degree, and making that a very visible, expressive and political kind of statement for audiences. So making time very visible as a dramaturgical element, as part of the performative experience. These examples, Memorandum, I think, is a good example of that, and OR, when you look at it in its extended documentation, but I think there are other very good examples that are more contemporary. So I do think it's a very important question you raised. Thank you.